and my grandmother gave me a real big slapping.
Scum like us, we're not allowed those benefits. We're not allowed a good education. They've got to keep us down.
And that dog was stolen outside the door. That was my biggest memory from it.
My music teacher was stabbed 42 times in the chest for confiscating a pornographic magazine off a pupil.
The chap on the phone goes, "Hello, is that Stephen Woolfe?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "It's Nigel Farage." I said, and I thought it was my brother taking the mickey.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest who has a lot in common with me, but we'll get into that in a minute. But first of all, welcome Stephen Woolfe to the show.
Good morning, Nick, and thanks very much for inviting me on. It's a real pleasure.
No, I've wanted to have you on now for at least a couple of years, but I've never bumped into you. We've never spoken, so it was very hard to invite you until I saw that tweet the other day and I commented straight away, and then you DM'd me. So that's how we got this sorted today. I've been following your political career for well over a decade. I remember when you was at UKIP, you were one of the main figures in UKIP. And then at the end of UKIP, you set something, you did other things, but now then you set up the Centre for Migration. But before we get into all that, I remember you being interviewed maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I realized, because you talked about it, where you were from, where you grew up as a child. I remember sat there going, I might have met you because as a very young person, you lived in Moss Side. I lived in Hume, which is next door. And then you moved to Burnage to live with your grandparents. I moved to Longsight to live with my grandparents. Longsight and Burnage are next door to each other. Half my school friends lived in Burnage. So we probably have shared friends and shared acquaintances, and we must have walked past each other in the street at some point when we were growing up.
Yeah, I can't find it impossible that we didn't, particularly if you played football in Longsight Park and kicked the ball around there. And I think when we had a pre-discussion about this, you knew about the pub at the Green End pub, which was the first pub that I ever worked in. I sneaked in there probably 16, 17 because my granddad used to be a regular there, and just in those days you could talk to the landlord and twist your arm and get in. So I'd be surprised with the backgrounds that we had that we just didn't meet. But here we are meeting literally for the first time now. But we share so much and share so, particularly the background. I think the background listening to you, and I started to read your book, and thanks for sending it over, suddenly realizing how so similar our backgrounds are, and the backgrounds of literally millions of people in this country who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s and seen the transformation, the terrible transformation in many ways of our own country.
No, absolutely. We've even got more in common. Your father was an immigrant, my father was an immigrant. You grew up in a single parent household, so did I. We both went to, inner city schools, even though you're probably almost next door to each other. There's so much similar there of your life journey and my life journey. What was your life like in Moss Side? Because I don't really remember Hume. I was far too young to remember.
Yeah, I was a little bit like you. I didn't recall a great deal of it. I mean, there are two big memories for me. We lived in Jarrett Street in a rented house, a landlord that allowed it to be pretty damp and wet and miserable. We had a dog, and that dog was stolen outside the door. That was my biggest memory from it. Um, and I think for us, it was just that my father was mixed race. In those days, he would have been called half caste, and I would have been grown up with quarter caste. And although people look at me now, they go, "Yeah, I can see a bit in your hair and maybe a little bit in your eyes, but your skin color's gone." And I said, "Yeah, well, I faded like Michael Jackson, but naturally over time." But he didn't, and he went off. And he wasn't a particularly pleasant man in many ways. I mean, his life himself was incredibly miserable, incredibly tortured. But that was where he took us. And eventually, I've spoken about it before, the kind of brutality that he exposed us to led my mum eventually to make a very brave decision and leave that home and go to Burnage. And we went and joined my grandma and grandfather who lived in Burnage, again around Fog Lane, near St Bernard's School, and we literally moved in. I don't know, probably I was about the age of 7 by that time. My brother was about 5.5. And what was my mum, a single parent? So she had me when I was 17. So she was coming up to 24. And we lived in a small room, my brother and I sharing a bed, and my mum living in that same room for 4 years. Now, for me and my brother, we knew no different. Sharing a bed at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, going to bed every night, me on one end and him on the other end. It didn't feel too awkward or weird, in some ways, except when people, you'd hear other people at school mentioning it different. But what I did feel sorry for and amazed by was my mum. When you think about it, she was a young woman. She was in her early 20s, having to go to bed every night in the same room as her two young children. And so I remember that, and the difficulties about watching people really monitor how much money we had and monitor the meter that we put the 50p's into the, to get the electricity, and having to go out and change coins that we collect so that we go and put it into the meter. I don't know if you remember the meter in the top corner of kitchens, and you had to go and put money in to make sure. And when went out and you didn't have it, it went out. That was it. It was early to bed, or and we were on gas. So that, we were always watching that, and I was always conscious of the poverty, not just of my family, but everybody else around us. And yet, despite that, and I think it's different today, there was this kind of level of spirit, community spirit. There was a story that my grandmother used to tell me, and just completely, I was reminded for a long time. I was probably about 7, and I'd go garden creeping, and which meant I would creep under the hedges between each of the houses, my brother and I, and we'd think that was fun. And one day we came back with some milk off the doorstep of somebody. I can't remember which neighbor it was. It was probably about 2 or 3 doors down. And my grandmother gave me a real big slapping. And I was crying, but we don't have any milk. And she slapped me and said, but that milk might be for the woman who's just been able to afford that milk and doesn't have any for her tea. And she dragged me back to the house to give her that bottle of milk. And it was that community. We might not have it, but they might not have it too. So I learned a huge amount about how important it was to not only support your own family, but even in depths of despair and not having very much, that we had to respect those who were next to us as well, who didn't have it too. And that community of that lady, and what that lady did that day is actually, she brought us in, gave us a cup of tea, and gave me a load of biscuits. So that's one of the essential memories of growing up in Moss Side and moving into Burnage. But also what it did was give me the respect of my grandparents as well, their moral values, their distinct ability to say, we carry on no matter what, despite everything else, but still have the dignity not to go begging or stealing.
Let me ask you this, because that's very similar to my upbringing. We had no money. I was never hungry, but we had no money. All my friends, they always seemed to have more money than me. I mean, their families, no kids had money. I mean, that was unheard of. But when I was growing up, I was the only kid in on my street and in my friends at school who came from a single parent household. Everybody else had a father, and I was the only one. And things have changed now. But what I look back upon my childhood was I was very happy. I came from a loving family. There was no issues in my household apart from, well, even having no money wasn't an issue. We always had food in the cupboards. But I came from a loving household, and that set me up for the rest of my life. Was your household a loving household?
In many ways it was, but in some ways it wasn't. There was always the shadow, unfortunately, of a very disruptive and aggressive father, that up around, and that I think always stuck around. there wasn't violence in the family. There was the kind of tension with my grandfather, who in so many ways was a lovely man, but just when the memories of what he had to go through in the Second World War would come through, there was no treatment for PTSD. He'd either be deeply silent or he would shout. And but generally, I would say it was a different kind of love. It was not affectionate with hugs every minute. It was, like you said, making sure we had food, making sure that we were warm. There were kind words to us when I was being bullied at school, for example, for the color of the skin that I had at the time, and the difference that I had. It was more about my curly hair. And also, the weird things you say about your dad. I mean, there were people who used to shout at me, "You've got no dad." And so at school, you'd get that sort of comment. So that loving element was all connected about that. But the not having anything. And I think also the difference is that my mum living in that room, it created little tensions for her as well. She was a young woman. So there was this idea that we had to look after each other, but it left little space for what people today say is giving the hugs and kisses that you see in every single movie. I would say that's the form of love that was a strengthened ability of the family sticking together. And other parts of the difficulty of life that I found became the formation of my views about fairness, equality, wealth creation, wealth spreading, dignity, the importance of the state, the importance of our nation's history, the importance of our culture and our politics. All of that was very, very important to me, but it was also become ingrained in me at that stage of looking around where we were. I became very aware. Some of the incredibly important things about the love that was really about education, Nick. It's the comments that we don't have very much, Stephen, but the one thing we can give you is help on education. It's so important to learn. It's so important to read. And they would read. Books were always around. My mum would. Uh, we very luckily dated a man that worked in a publisher's, and we'd get loads of free books particularly at Christmas, and we get all of those, and they would read to me, and it was intensely important to kind of learn. And my grandfather didn't do much when it came to reading at all, but he would read poetry. My mum wrote poetry. My grandmother used to sing, which kind of this happy songs that echoes around the cold kitchen. And so that was really, really important about the education and teaching us that was what was needed to get out and get on.
Well, that's the difference between me and you. My household didn't value education. They weren't anti-education, but education never came into it. I educated myself basically through TV, documentaries, watching old films, and some of that would have been propaganda and biased and incorrect, but that's how I educated myself. And listening to my grandfather tell me stories at night because we shared a bedroom. So he'd tell me about the Second World War, the adventures he went on, eating snakes, being torpedoed by the Japanese. And it was those stories that made me want to travel around the world. So I've traveled around the world now many times. I've been to dozens and dozens of countries. I've been to countries that most people never heard of and couldn't even find on a map. So that was sort of the education I got out of my family. But then you obviously valued education. I'm presuming you got a good education. And how did that lead into politics?
Well, I was lucky in many ways. As I say, we did learn. We got some really negative stuff at my school, St. Bernard's, but we put in for the scholarship at St. Bede's College, the Roman Catholic, what was once a seminary, and it was, and then became a private school. And I entered into the entrance examination in that for when I was about 10. And I remember my teacher at school saying, "Stephen's clever, but he's not that clever. There's no way that he's ever going to get into St. Bede's." And I won a scholarship for a bursary. I came in the top 5, and they therefore paid my education for 5 years. And that education gave me a background in classics like Latin. enabled me to open my eyes out to French and other languages, particularly and maths and history, which I adored, in a very classical and formal way, sometimes taught by nuns, but mainly by teachers. And it gave me the importance to mix with people from different backgrounds. There are a lot of people who are wealthy who live in North Manchester, who come out from Cheshire and Trafford. There were those people who won different kinds of scholarships, but there was also a lot of people who had, basically the opportunity to come to that school because their councils had paid for them. And that's why I'm a very kind of big supporter of the idea of grammar schools, because it enabled me to mix with lots more people. And I think a grammar school, in so many ways, with having people who are rich and poor and middle class, was much more of a comprehensive school than the current comprehensive schools are. And I find it violently hypocritical, and I really do, when you get socialist and left-wing politicians who say, we want to close down private schools, we want to close down grammar schools, but they're quite happy to be able to send their children to it, or they won't oppose it.
They can afford it.
I find vile, quite frankly.
Yeah. And most of them have been to grammar schools and private schools themselves, send their children to private schools and fee-paying schools. Diane Abbott is a great example.
Just thinking about her,
she
absolutely.
sent her son to a fee-paying school. Jeremy Corbyn sent his two boys to a grammar school. But yet, for me and you, scum like us, we're not allowed those benefits. We're not allowed a good education. They've got to keep us down. But it's good enough for them and their children. They're hypocrites.
Absolutely. And that's a word that I think you've summed up. They think about the English. They think about the English children as scum because they want to keep us controlled. They don't want us educated. They don't want educated leaders who've come out of those backgrounds to understand what they're doing. They just want us as voting fodder to be able to turn around, and the only way out is to join a trade union and be a sycophant for the big bosses at the top, not thinking for themselves, not giving the opportunity to climb the ladder and open their own businesses, not trying the opportunity to be educated and not think like them. They just want to control you. And if they can keep the numbers of the working class small, that they allow a few to go off to Oxford and Cambridge and then drag them into the Labour Party, keep them controlled like that, they're perfectly happy like that. But they don't want those who really still feel, and I still feel in my bones sometimes, what I grew up in and how I grew up in and how those people are still suppressed. That's what kind of drove me through into politics from the education. And you talk about that. I was lucky to go to St. Bede's. I won scholarships. I got my exams, and they encouraged me to do stuff such as law. You know, I would never have really thought about it. But I do often remember that before I got into law, which is the way that you move into politics in so many ways, is that, do you ever remember Crown Court, the TV show that we used to have? And my grandmother and grandfather used to sit down and watch that with me, and they'd say, Stephen, you can be that. That's the pinnacle of our protection of the people in this court, the barristers and the solicitors, understanding how important law was for the protection of human rights and the protection of ourselves as individuals. And I moved into becoming a barrister. It took me a long time. I've never been allowed to practice it for the past 10 years, unfortunately, because I'm blackballed because of my support of Brexit. There are no chambers out there that are willing to accept me in to do any work anymore. Every time I get near one, someone says they stop me from getting in by saying, oh, he's too outspoken on immigration. We're not work with him because he was a Brexiteer. So I'm offended by the way that even that institution has been perverted and changed so that it only protects the elitist ideas in this country, when it was still an opportunity to reach out. But that's what I did. I went to St. Bede's and then off to law at university in Aberystwyth.
Right. There's something there similar to me and something there that's not similar. The similar thing is you've been blackballed as a barrister. I've been blackballed from working in the charity sector because of what happened to me, because I'm outspoken. So I got an MBE for my charity work, set up an award-winning charity, and I had to leave that charity in the end because housing associations, councils, and grant makers would say to the charity, "We're not giving you money while Nick Buckley's involved." So I had to leave the charity I founded because I'm outspoken on many issues. And something that's not similar is our education. I went to a school that you'll probably heard of called Central High School for Boys, based at Bellevue in Gorton. Failing school. It closed down the year after I left. It was you don't realize it at the time because it's the only school you know. But looking back, it was atrocious. That's why they closed it down. It was a failing school. My music teacher was stabbed 42 times in the chest for confiscating a pornographic magazine off a pupil. A newly young female teacher was sexually assaulted by 12 students in the stairwell. I could walk from my English classroom into my geography classroom through a hole in the wall where students had kicked the breeze blocks out of the wall to make a new doorway. So it was a shortcut across the building. That was my schooling. It was like Escape from New York. But at the time, you don't realize. There was no decent teachers. All the good teachers had left years ago, so we got newly qualified teachers, and failing teachers were the only teachers left in my school. I got an extremely poor education. I managed to pass my O levels, which are now called GCSEs, but that was only because I was inherently fairly intelligent. It wasn't to do with the education. Um, I look back now and think if I'd went to a decent school, I I I potentially could have been prime minister. I could have been, a lot further on in a career, my development, if I'd gone to a half decent school, but I went to a completely failing school.
Yeah, and I understand that, Nick, and I knew the school, I knew its reputation when we were growing up, and I'm inherently and intensely thankful that St. Bede's gave me the scholarship to get out, because I would have gone to St. Mark's, which was down the road, which had equally bad reputation. I know it was not great. It was pretty awful because my brother went there. The only other people that have ever succeeded from that school are Liam and Noel Gallagher, but they did it in a totally different world. I knew what was happening. If you go to the schools in Manchester, in the north of Manchester, and also towards Chorlton, they were failing schools. I saw a girls' school that my sister, although you could be a brother nowadays and go to a girls' school, can't you?
Say that's very enlightened of you in the 80s to have a trans sibling.
My sister, we fought for a year for my sister not to go there, because it had such a bad reputation, was so far away, and that the council refused to do so, and she ended up being off school for a year, and that impacted her education. The education authorities, such as Manchester's education authorities, are the crux and the cause of so much restriction on education of young people by their dogmatic views, by their atrocious attitude to funding, by their atrocious attitude to new wave thinking, whether it's DEI at the moment or transgender philosophies, rather than classical education. And they're part of the Labour Party's anti-education towards poor people, quite frankly, and the working class of this country. And I would abolish them. I'm seeing what's going over in the United States Department of Education. Abolish it. I'd abolish the whole lot. I'd give people money and say that is how much the government says is worth your education. That's how much you'd have. You go and spend it as you will at a school that wants you. And I tell you what, there'll be academies out there that would offer the education that I got at St. Bede's and that you didn't have the opportunity to have, who would take it for that money. And we would crush the comprehensive system in this country in a way, so much so that it would embarrass them. It would just embarrass them, because the education standards in this country would rise. The teachers would have proper buildings. They would be paid incredibly well. They'd have students that, if you look at that wonderful teacher in London, I always get a Catherine Babasinghe, who does tremendously well. I put her in charge and tell her just to fire people who are no good at their job. And that would give more people like you and I the opportunity to grow and expand, because that's my interest. I'm not interested in the council leaders or their people involved in the authorities. They can go swivel as far as I'm concerned, because I don't think they really care. They only care about their money and their pensions. I'd care about those teachers and head teachers who really care. And I care about the students who are missing out on education because of a system that is failing. I'm lucky. you're lucky that you had an inherent education in yourself and the ability to go on. But there are thousands of children every year who have failed in education. And you can see it riles me. It was one of the things that I think is crucially important. And what we have at the moment is a failure. And this government are going to make it 20 times, 100 times worse because they just don't care, and they're filled with hypocrites who send their children to private schools or schools in areas that they can afford that already have great reputations. It incenses me, as you can probably tell.
No, I completely agree. My wife said something to me years ago, which I've never forgot, and I've stole it now as if it's my phrase. And she says, education is a gift we give our children.
Oh, gosh, I couldn't agree more. I really couldn't agree more. My opportunities to open my eyes up to the like Shakespeare or Blake, and to be able to read to the Russian five composers of Borodin and Tchaikovsky and hear that music. I remember the first time I heard classical music. I sat in the room and today I still feel it. I still feel the shivers coming through me. My love of classical music came in on a teacher that just opened up by playing music that I'd never heard of before. And my mum then went out and bought one of those box sets that you used to have of classical music. I still have it. I still have it today because it's just a memory of what education can give you and open up your eyes to what the rich were already having through public schools such as Eton and Harrow and all the ones that most of our university educated prime ministers, except this particular one who didn't go to that type of school, but they all got it. And I had that opportunity.
Yeah, I bought my own classical music set when I was 11 or 12 from a bring and buy sale at a Christmas fete at a school round the corner because again, I wouldn't have got that at school. And the irony is, if you was in school today, being mixed race, you would be listening to some rap artist because your teacher would be saying, "Oh, you look a bit black to me." So that's the sort of music, that's the sort of thing I'm going to teach you is about rap and about grime. And do you know what? How disgusting and racist is that? We should be exposing children to the greatness of the world, not to some of the crap we're producing today. There's a reason why Beethoven and Mozart and, Handel are being played today. They've stood the test of time. People thought they were amazing when they came out, but hundreds of years later, people still think they're amazing. And that's because they're amazing. No one's going to be playing Stormzy in 20, 30 years' time.
Absolutely. I look at the end of the day, I used to listen to African Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force. I'd watch, I did breakdancing. I was Manchester's first breakdance in a bloody champion, I think, when I was about 17. Got some dingy little room that was in the middle of central Manchester. And then I got mugged from my prize money as soon as I came out of the bloody venue. And so I love that music too. I watched it. I listened to it. My daughter can listen to it, but I don't need to be taught that in school. I need to be taught about the greats. And you were probably white privileged there, Nick, for actually mentioning Beethoven. How dare they? Well, I read Malcolm X. I look across my, bookcase here, and I've got a variety of books from all different writers. I've got Malcolm X on there. I have Donald Woods and Biko, which I wrote my theses on. I have James Baldwin, Alan Paton. All of these are writers who are black from different, well, excluding Donald Woods, who wasn't, of course, across the globe. And I read them when I was younger. I was exposed to it. But to remove our English heritage, our English writers, our English artists, our English musicians, just for woke ideology is actually a disservice to the young people of this country. And again, it goes back to ideology, the ideology of the left, which is relatively sick when it comes to really wanting equality. They want conformity. They want control. They don't want your minds open. They want to be able to ensure that it only thinks in one way.
I agree. But how did that then lead on to you being interested in politics and your UKIP days?
Well, the politics was easy. Obviously, seeing poverty, seeing people that we grew up with, that makes you political. Of course, the reading does that. I did, and actually also being mixed race, with the Irish in me and the black in me and the Jewish and the Catholic in me, it all brings up all of those. And when I went to university, it's quite natural. I actually got involved with the Labour Party. I probably did actually in the year before I went to university and campaigned for the Labour Party. It's inevitable. That's what we will grow up to believe. The Labour Party was there to support the working class. And I thought, right, I'll go and do it. And at university, I got involved in the Labour movement there, but not so much. Really, they backed me when I tried to become president of Aberystwyth University. I didn't win. I won to someone who is a black lady who sang a song about South Africa, pretending she was from South Africa, when actually she was born somewhere in London. And that was what exposed me to the first element of what the kind of woke ideology is: pretend that you're something you're not, just to try and get a vote in and push yourself up the ladder. I then went to London, still feeling I was slightly Labourish, and joined the Society of Black Lawyers, where I suddenly, and as a barrister, trying to become a barrister, I met lots of lefty Labourites who are now on the Labour benches, including our Prime Minister, who founded a set of chambers I applied to, and they rejected me, for probably not being woke enough, actually, at the time. But they did take on some of the people I knew in the Society of Black Lawyers. And I remember a couple of things transforming me after that particular moment. There was the rise of the Labour Party under Tony Blair, particularly Mandelson. And I got involved with a chap called Derek Draper, who became Mandelson's chief of staff. He was encouraging me to join the Labour Party. He said, and one day he sat down and said, "Stephen, you're perfect. You're mixed race. You're single parent. You come from Moss Side. You're born in Manchester. You're working class. Gee, you are definite cabinet material. We'll have you on telly." And it was all about image at that stage. And two or three things happened to me at that stage, turned me off the Labour Party. The first was Mandelson. I met Mandelson, and I was at a Fabian Society meeting, and it was very clear that they were saying whatever they wanted to get into power, but they were abusing Tony Benn. And Tony Benn was my first political book, Arguments of Socialism. I still have it, literally up there. And it was all talking about opposing the European Union, how corporatism is controlling the country, low wage, low economy, which we know we are in. And then they were going to impact child benefits. And he denied that they were going to do it. And of course they did it. And I thought, I don't like that. The second thing is immigration was beginning to have an impact, not hugely in the same way as today. And it became very clear to me that Tony Blair, in his speeches, was opening the door to large-scale immigration, which, as you and I know, in our communities, that just pushed the wages down. It made it even more difficult to get work. And I thought, how can that be helping the working class in our country when you're doing that? So you're impacting benefits, you're bringing in people that can push down wages. And I think then I went to a Society of Black Lawyers, and who was it? It was Paul Boateng, who I think at the time was a minister in the government. He sat down, he said, we want to have a chat with you. And I said, well, I'm quarter caste. And he went, oh no, you can't say that. In the Labour Party, you mustn't use phrases like that. There are certain phrases we have to stick to. Why don't you be a bit more expansive? Call yourself quadroon.
Quadroon.
So I went, it said it's French. I went, okay, so I can call myself not quarter caste because that's English, but I can call myself quarter caste in French. And that'll be all right for the Labour Party at the moment. And it became very clear that they really weren't about the working class. It was about power for themselves, and it was about a different agenda. So I dropped out. I went and did my job as a lawyer. I went off and did various other things. And then I always felt that the European Union was wrong. I watched the arguments. I worked in the City of London. I'd crawled up the ladder. I'd become influential in the hedge fund industry, chaired the Hedge Fund Lawyers Association. And we started to see European regulations, particularly one called the Alternative Investment Fund Management Directive. To most people, that doesn't mean anything, but what it did, it meant the European Union were controlling a big industry, hedge funds, and making us effectively lose business to French and German institutions or those in America, crushing things that we were doing something like 64 billion pounds in revenue to the country by it. And I thought I was opposing it. I did a speech one day, and it was funny, where I argued that whoever had drafted this particular directive clearly didn't know about hedge funds, clearly didn't know about financial services, and clearly didn't know enough about the law of fund management. And I would love to meet them and tell them. And the presenter said, well, you might get that soon enough. And unfortunately, it sat me at the table at lunch with a German young lawyer called Klaus Tollmann, who drafted it. Now, he was about 27. Intelligent and nice enough lad. But when I questioned him, I said, have you ever been in hedge funds, fund management? No. Where did you come from? The Bundesbank. So how can you draft legislation that you don't know anything about and never met or talked to people like ourselves? And he said it was a deal done by the commissioner of the European Union, who was Spanish, to get votes from the socialist left, particularly a Danish socialist who said he wanted to harm private equity funds and hedge funds. It needed to be done, and that is why I'm doing it. And it became very clear. This was about a man wanting to be the chairman of the commission, talking to socialists who had a beef, and therefore I'll destroy an industry not related to either of their countries. And then I was invited by a member of the House of Lords to attend an event to describe what I'd seen in the City of London in House of Commons. So I went, and there I met a huge number of people. Dan Hannan was there from the Conservatives. I remember trade union representatives, Bob Crow, his team were there from the left, and all of these opposing the European Union. So I had trade unionists, Conservative members, bankers, all these interested. And then a few days later, I got a telephone call whilst I was watching Spooked on a Sunday night. Do you remember Spooked?
I do.
I used to love that series. And the chap on the phone goes, hello, is that Stephen Woolfe? I said, yes, it is. He said, it's Nigel Farage. I said, and I thought it was my brother taking the mickey.
Yes.
I said, oh, Mike, please put it away. Is that you? This is Nigel Farage on it. Oh, hello, Nigel. How are you? And he said, I would like to meet you. And would you be interested in joining my team as a spokesman for the City of London and talk about what's happening? And then I was invited in 2010 to go to Torquay by the chairman of the UKIP at the time. Not a member. I hadn't joined, but I just went to see. And of course, I was cautious. People had talked about these people being the party of racists in smart suits. So I talked to my family, and my mum, remember my mum saying to me, listen, Stephen, remember the press want an enemy, and they'll always criticize new people. You just go down there and see who they are, speak to them. And if these people are racists, you're not a member, you can walk away. But you make up your own decision. Don't listen to the press, because they'll always pervert it for their own particular slant and their own political masters. So I went in 2010. I met with Nigel. I gave a speech at the Torquay conference. And I met people who were landowners to working class people like myself, black, white, men, women, young, old, basically the people of Britain, the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, ordinary citizens concerned about their country, its direction, passionate about change and wanting to see a difference. I didn't see racists there at all. Hope Not Hate were trying to engender some idea that they were full of racists. And of course, there's obviously going to be the odd one or two who came out of the woodwork later on. But generally, these were ordinary people. And that's what got me into UKIP. That telephone call, that meeting in the House of Lords, and but more than anything else, turning up at Torquay and meeting people like yourself, Nick, who were really exasperated and felt that there needed to be some fundamental change in this country. that we could achieve by a new political party. Ordinary people fed up and angry and wanting positive change. That's what I call patriots, people who believed in our nation.
I once got a phone call 10 years ago, and a gentleman, I forget his name now, a gentleman said, "Hi, my name is such a thing. I'm calling on behalf of Boris Johnson's policy unit, because he was Prime Minister at the time. Would like to." I went, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa. Who's this? Who's this?" Oh no, I just told you, Mr. Buckley, that I went, "You're going to have to prove who you are. I'm not having a conversation with someone on the phone who tells me they're phoning up on behalf of the Prime Minister to speak to me." So he said, "I'll email you now, and you'll be able to tell from my email address that this is an official government email address." So he emailed me, and I phoned him back and went, "Right, I now believe who you are. Go on, let's have a conversation."
It is funny when you get a call like that. I mean, I'm sure that, if you're born in certain circles, a telephone call like that would have been absolutely natural. But at that time, I'm middle of spooks as well. I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is not quite what it was.
So then you joined UKIP, and that's when I remember you from. You joined UKIP. You were heavily involved. What were the highlight? I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. This nation owes UKIP a big thank you, because if it wasn't for UKIP, we never would have almost left the European Union. And I know Brexit up to now has been a failure. But that's not because Brexit's a failure. That's because the people in charge have never taken advantage of the fact that we've left the EU. Those advantages, those benefits are sat on the shelf. And one of these days in the near future, we're going to have a government that comes along and is willing to take those benefits and those advantages and to improve this country. So Brexit at the moment has been stalled as far as I'm concerned. But the benefits will come once we get politicians in the government who actually want the benefits of Brexit.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that those people, the millions who campaigned for UKIP, those who founded it, those who funded it, those who supported it in days when it was laughed at and ridiculed, all are deserved of the honour and respect, and in many ways a monument to their strength of feeling and patriotism, but also belief in the democratic values of this nation. And I applaud them. I'm sorry I had to leave them, because within the camps of UKIP's nominated officials in the back office and elected officials, the same greed and selfishness that infects the vast majority of establishment politicians infected a minority of UKIP politicians who used it for their own ends and just could not see the wood for the trees, and helped really bring it down. It enabled Nigel to be able to find a way to move on to other things, but they brought it down themselves. And in doing so, they damaged the incredible hard work that was done. And I think those people who supported UKIP, if they've moved on to reform, I hope they're not going to be as disappointed. I do believe they won't be in the same way, actually. I think the professionalism of reform is wholly different. They've removed quite a lot of the bad wood that was there with UKIP, and I long for them to be able to succeed in exceeding the expectations of those people supporting them, because the country needs it. It needs Nigel and Richard Tice and all the other MPs that are there at the moment to keep advancing their game, but expanding across the country, so that legacy of the campaigning nature of our freedom-loving individuals that were there in UKIP and who've moved forward can actually fulfill its hope. And that hope is that, I'm with you, Nick, Brexit has not been achieved. We've got a demi-Brexit, a part Brexit, a part-time Brexit, in that we've left the European Union in the sense of its political institutions. We're not in the Parliament, the Commission, the Council. We're not paying the annual fee, but we're tied by visible regulatory links to them that are still controlling parts of our economy. They're still got the mentality between the never moaners, who just cannot see a world beyond those controlling us in the European Commission and Council. And they just want to hand over the democratic history to them because of either a hatred of the United States or a hatred of their own people, that's you and I and the working class, and those who are now growing to trying to build the reform package. Their hatred of anybody that is not of their class, their ilk, and their view. And it's as in many ways what George Orwell described in A Road to Wigan Pier, when he said that socialists would rather mix with the foreigner than deal with their own working class. That the socialists are all those who are intellectuals but can't stand the working class socialist. They're happy to sit in their own champagne socialism, but when they have to get down to the nitty gritty and help someone who's living in absolute abject poverty in a house, that's kind of distorted, disgruntled, devastated by the poverty that's within that, they don't want to get involved. They really don't. And so
I was going to say then that they look upon the poor working class, as we said before, the word scum, but they look upon and say to themselves, why can't you be more like me? And if I controlled your life instead of you controlling your life, you'd be so much happier because I know so much, I know more things than you. I'm better than you. If I can just control everything in your life, you will be happier. And that's how they treat the working class.
they do, but it's not. It's a division in the working class now. Because if you're an immigrant working class who's come over an asylum, we want to just hand you everything. We want to give you a house. We want to give you benefits. We'll get you off and grant you the right to remain. And then you can go to a council and be headed up on the list of getting a council accommodation, which has been worked for by millions of these people, millions of British people for years who've paid into a system that they can no longer get. And then they'll turn to those who can't get those housing, who can't get the same benefits and say, well, you're lazy, or why don't you get a job? Or if I take control of your life, just as you said, Nick, I can make it better for you. It's a two-tier benefit system. It's a two-tier nationality system. It's a two-tier socialist system where if you're with us and one of us will help you, and if you're not, we won't. And I always remember it in terms of when it took us about 10 years to get a council house, Nick, and eventually we did. And there were some big issues about it. And my mum got involved. And there was one of the lads there, big lad, down in Withington at this stage. And we knew him. And my mum, we had a load of people complaining to the councillor, but he acted as a bother boy to protect the councillor. And we grew up with him. And we said to him, why are you stopping us down in our view to the council? And he went, well, I'm getting paid by them now, look. And I'm a member of the Labour Party. And as long as I'm a member of the Labour Party, I'm well looked after. So if you want to get higher up on the council housing list, join the Labour Party and we'll sort you out. We'll help out our own. That's what Labour's all about. Discrimination, division, and hatred in many ways. And I just can't deal with them at all anymore because I think they are just hypocrites and they're not out there. And I hope that reform can understand the working class views in this country and the lower middle class, because let's be fair now, Nick. What we thought was once working class and on the edge of poverty and struggling each month with your wage packet, that's now spread across not to the lower middle classes, but is actually also touching the middle classes. And that expansion of struggling, the idea that we might not make it to the end of the month, or we can't afford things such as gas, electricity, water, mortgages, and our children can't get a home, that's spread. And it's spread in this country, in a country that's supposedly filled with socialists.
Yeah, well, that's what socialism always does, doesn't it? It always destroys every single country. No one can ever point to a successful socialist government because one's never existed. Let's jump to the European Parliament. How long was you in the European Parliament? What are your memories of that? And is there any funny stories of what went on in the European Union Parliament?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was there for the 5 years, 2014, 2019. I think, the first memory is the ecstatic sense of winning the European elections, standing on the platform in Manchester. Imagine being a Mancunian in Manchester Town Hall, standing in that beautiful building, and suddenly your name's being rung out and it said Stephen Woolfe elected to the European Parliament. I could not be any prouder of my mum and my family, my, at that time, unfortunately, dead grandmother and grandfather. I wish they'd been able to see me. And that was brilliant. And what was funny was just literally almost falling off the stage, to get a photograph afterwards. That kind of brings you back down to earth. Okay, it's not so big after all, Stephen. Thankfully, there were no cameras collecting. But actually, I was in that same hall on the night that the vote for Brexit occurred too. So those two memories in the European Parliament, sitting there, this beautiful picture with my team looking at us, we'd won. The British people are win. So those two are the highlights of my time in the European Parliament. The obvious downside was being attacked by a member who still denies it, and there's no evidence either way in terms of the police report, unfortunately. So I left UKIP, having been the collapsing and that horrid picture that my daughter will have to continually see of me down in the European Parliament, and leaving UKIP, and also watching the abuse I got from members of my own elected team, and the desperate attempts to stop me becoming leader of UKIP by allegations that I hadn't put my application into time when we had evidence to show that we did, the accusations that I committed electoral fraud, and the police coming in, which the police came out and said, no, I'm afraid we don't have any evidence of that, but that was not pushed across the newspapers. And then discovering later on that all of that was actually created by people within the hierarchy of UKIP who were briefing that out to the press to undermine me and destroy my reputation. But I was willing to take all of that until the attack and the damage that did, which led to divorce within a few weeks, the separation from me and my daughter. So all of that, and then the independence. But I didn't stop though, Nick. If you remember, I may have left UKIP, but I carried on from October 2016 till I left in May of 2019. I still campaigned for Brexit. I still was across the airways talking about immigration. I founded the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity to get the numbers out. I spoke regularly with people from different political parties, and much to the annoyance of people in what was still remained of UKIP, was that I had a regular monthly meeting with Michel Barnier. I still got a cross of the headways. So it was still me going into Barnier with a group of business people to go and speak to him about Brexit and the campaigns. And so I continued campaigning and doing what I believed was my job. I wasn't going to let the people who voted me down. I wasn't going to let those people in UKIP who wanted me to be leader down. I carried on the campaign right through to 2019, and I've carried on the immigration arguments and speaking about politics since, but obviously not in the same way.
That's a good segue into what you're doing now. So that led into what you're doing now, which is the Centre for Migration. What's that? What does it involve, and what are you trying to achieve with that?
Well, the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity, I founded in the latter days of me leaving the European Parliament, because immigration is a massive issue, not just here in the UK. It's a massive issue in Europe and across the globe. And I do believe that the elites want to maintain huge numbers of immigration in this country to change our culture, to change our history, to damage our economics, and to fit in some global ideology of a one world without anything that's related to history, culture of nations, and destroying the nation states by doing so. But I also wanted to prove that immigration, when managed and controlled, is actually a positive. You and I, as I said, had immigrant parents or grandparents who come into this country. Millions of people in this country are connected in some ways. And it's not about the people themselves. It's about the policymakers who want to destroy the unity of a nation. And so I wanted to have a numbers-based organization that just put the numbers out. Let people think about the numbers of people coming into the country, whether it's asylum or legal, the costs of those people coming in on housing to the taxpayer, the impact on population, So I just started creating numbers and fact sheets, and I started publishing them out and then commenting on the policies. I created a paper called the Forward Thinking Immigration Policy for Britain, which was adopted in some ways by both the Vote Leave and Leave campaign. And that showed a way of having policies to reduce the numbers at that time to 50,000 a year of net migration and still be able to maintain our services in health and care homes and be able to increase wages in this country. So I think a fair, flexible, and forward-thinking immigration policy was my first booklet on that, and also suggested a migration council. That was also partly adopted by those like Boris Johnson. And there was a BBC documentary that put me alongside Boris Johnson and Cameron and Clegg and Farage and Suella Braverman and others, all of those who were linking up with the people who were thinking about immigration at that time. And I'm pleased that they did, but in many ways, Boris allowed mass migration to come in. So the Centre for Migration is about putting the numbers out to people. I've kind of got back into it recently. I had to close everything down for 2 years for health reasons and some personal reasons, unfortunately. Many people are aware that I had a couple of brain tumors over the last couple of years, possibly caused by what happened to me in the European Parliament. And I had to close a lot of things down. So I've restarted that roughly in around November of last year. Now it keeps growing. I'm going to offer it out to people to help fund my work if I can. If I get money in, I can do specific policies that I'd like to be able to do. But everything has been done by myself at the moment. And I haven't got any money from anybody to help me along in that way. I'm not provided with cash by some secret Russian millionaire or some, organization like Tufton Street, as the left want to do. This is hardcore research, and it's being done for the benefit of this people of this country.
If you had to name one or two points that have come to you recently about migration that most people don't know about, what are one or two stats or points or policies that you think we need to know about?
Okay, I would say the numbers of asylum applicants is 1.2 million since the year 2000. That the growth of population in this country is not going to be 74 million, but 80 million by the year 2040. 80 million by 2040. That's a population increase of 33.5% in 40 years. That the cost to the government each year at the moment of illegal migration and legal migration and asylum is £8 billion a year. And I project it will go up to 10 billion within the next 2 years. And that what you will see in terms of the population mix of the white British community by 2040 will be around 67%. And I would suggest that the Asian Middle East community will be going up to nearly 20%.
That's a completely different country to the one me and you grew up in, isn't it?
Within 40 years, my lifetime, it is no longer a country that is predominantly white or Christian, that respects our institutions, our statutes, our history. It is a country that will want to destroy and pull down churches as they do statutes, that will promote diversity, equality, and inclusion, which means exclusion of those of the white community, as I say. And I think what you will see is a transformation of the cost of immigration, and culturally, it will be a very different nation. Now, people will say you're a scaremonger, that is a racist statement, that people will want to stay the same, but it's not. If you actually are looking at a nation and take the pictures of the 1950s and look at the pictures today, they are vastly different. If you look at cities and towns, and if you look at the way of our culture, it is very different. As we talked about in schools, let's have songs in our music classes about Taylor Swift or some sort of rap versus other types of music rather than classical. Look at the writing that we listen, the writers that we are educated by. Look at the people that are talking on TV about particular cultural issues. It's not about what we know, it's about more modern history. And that modern history, the modern culture, the modern music, and what we see in our artistic world is totally different. Now, they say that's a conclusion because of the change in the communities. We need to be inclusive to everyone. But if our communities hadn't changed so rapidly, perhaps they would have integrated and liked the same sort of things that we did. But maybe that certainly won't happen. And I think in some ways, I'm not sure that we'll ever get the cultural change to reverse without something incredibly dramatic, or those people who are like myself, who are mixed race, be able to say, hang on, actually, what they're proposing in the future is totally alien and wrong to this country and will actually damage it. And therefore, we're going to join those who are more conservative about our institutions. My fear is, though, when you've got institutions like the Church of England who are totally opposed to actually being Christian in many ways, that support all these transformations, when you've got our political institutions who don't care and are happy to see the change, you've got our cultural institutions like museums removing everything that is really about the history, and we are allowing people to get away pulling down statues and changing our cultural history, then the fight is huge. And are we just being like the king who, put his finger in the dam?
Yeah, yeah. Can you see? I see change coming. I see what's happening across Western Europe. I see the last 2 weeks of the first, Trump's administration, and I'm looking at all this change, and we're not going to get change from this Labour government, but hopefully it'll be the government after this one. Can you see change coming?
I can see some positive change coming, and it puts me in this way: if Trump is staying 5 strong years at the level that he's continuing now, for example, yesterday abolishing DEI in sports, no transgender women in sports. If he then also translates the view of no DEI in financial services and bans companies that are outside of the United States from being able to even trade in the United States if they have DEI, that will force companies and banks in our countries to actually remove that as well, and in Europe. If he is then able to sustain that into a next election where it's not necessarily him standing, but Vance is able to continue that agenda, and we get 10 or 15 years of America doing this, then absolutely, then there'll be no choice for big businesses and corporates to turn away from that. Then here, we need to find the party like Reform performing in such a way, and I think they'll achieve that in Wales next year, that they actually engender enough strength to win first past the post, and then have enough individuals, maybe learn from what Trump is doing with Elon Musk and others, to actually have a team in place ready to go after the civil service and also other entities within our own deep state that don't want to change this, firing people across institutions such as the National Trust, removing funding from any organization that carries on with this agenda, abolishing the Department of Education, replacing it with education for children, not education for politics and political agendas. That's what I would like to see. Old school in many ways. And if we can do that, that will work.
What I think you've just said then is basically the UKIP struggle was the first part of the problem to solve. Now we've left the EU, this is the next fight, and it's going to take several decades, just like UKIP took several decades. This next fight is going to take several decades if we're going to get this country back.
So, Nick, do I think there's some element of us being able to be successful in the future and what happens with our country? It goes back to something that in your book, which I've read, which I'd encourage people to read, My England, My England. And at the very beginning of that, you have a phrase by Elizabeth I, which I used to quote in my speeches, and it is, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." Our nation has faced huge difficulties when people from the elites have taken over, whether they are military elites like the Romans or the Normans, to those of our political elites who were heading up our countries in the times of Peterloo, or the Pentridge martyrs, or the Tolpuddle martyrs. And on each occasion that we've faced them, we've been able to transform our nation back somewhat to the way that it was. In the terms of the Romans, they put their culture across their country and destroyed the Britons and the Angles that were there. And so when they went, we started to reimpose our culture once again. With the Normans, slightly different. They imposed Norman culture, but only a few of them. But they allowed our kind of laws and common law system to remain in place. And actually, what we did is the elites began to see that there's actually a much better way, and that led us to the Wars of the Roses, and indeed our own civil war that brought back that English culture once again. Whether it was the people of this country challenging those elites and being brutalized or shipped off to Australia, as many of them did, or being hung, drawn, and quartered if they challenged the authorities, we've got similar elements going on now. You and I have both been cancelled. That's the modern day equivalent of being hung, drawn, and quartered. But if we are able to bring ourselves together once more with those people who've come and lived in this country, who recognize the importance of our common law, our history, our legal systems, then once again, I think that we can actually bring some semblance of what England and Britain is again. Not quite as it always was, but maybe still maintain some of the most important parts of our history.
I can completely agree. I don't think anybody wants England to remain static, to always be what it's always been, because that's never been a time that's existed. Countries, people, culture is constantly changing, but that change is always at an acceptable pace. Sometimes there's spikes, when the printing press was invented, now the internet's been invented. There's times that give us problems because we don't know how to cope with it. But change comes slowly, and change comes through consent. Because if it's not consent, then it's war. And we need to avoid going down, the path that leads to violence.
I agree. We should never go down to the path that leads to violence, but violence occurs only when the elites have led themselves to be in such a material sense of power and influence and ignorance of the needs of the people of their country. We have seen that through our history. And there is a thread. There is a thread of what it means to be English, whether it is still the fact that we've got 80% of our DNA in most of the people in this country that can go back to before 1066. That thread of what it is, and that culture that we talked about early on, Nick, about the art and the history, the poetry, the films, the idea of what it means to be part of being English through our political changes, our and indeed our cultural diversity that we had before the changes that occurred after 1950 with different countries coming in. We had England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales integrating as well. So all of that is still the thread that makes this nation great. All we need to do is encourage people who have come here to understand that thread. And some do. A friend of mine who is Polish, he came here, and after 6 years, he learned about England, and he went for his own nationality exam and became a citizen of Great Britain. And he loved it. He stood there in front of a picture of the king and sang the national anthem. I have seen images of people accepting nationality and wearing their own scarves or their own flags and not supporting the nation that they're in. That's not integration. But there are those from different countries who believe that it's important to be here. And we're not just simply a Bank of England where they can take as much money as they can from us until the time comes that they can ship themselves back to whichever country they came from or wherever they want to go.
And that's a good point, because that's what England and the UK has become. We've become a cross between an international airport lounge and an economic zone. People come here, some of them very good, but they come here to benefit themselves. And if a better place turns up somewhere in the world, or a better opportunity, they then go there. And if this country fails tomorrow, and let's say, the Bank of England collapses, our pound ends up being worth a penny, the mass exodus from this country of people who've only been here 10, 20, 30 years would put the Bible to shame, the exodus we would see, because many people have not bought into this country. Many people have come here because it was more convenient and a better option than living where they were living. And a country can't exist like that. We had some questionnaires last year on young people. It was something like 40, 50% of young people aged between 18 and 35 who were the fighting young people said they wouldn't fight for the country. How are we going to exist if the people living wouldn't fight a war for this country? And it wasn't like we're going to send you to Iraq. They were talking about if this country was going to be invaded and they still wouldn't fight. That's the damage that's been done by our external enemies, making us weaker, making us less patriotic. So we're easier to defeat in the future.
Well, I would say that, but also, there is another reason why people no longer want to fight for this country. And that is because if you are a white working class individual in this country, what are you actually fighting for? You're fighting for diversity, DEI, or you're fighting for your voice to be crucified if you challenge the elites. If you see those people who come from the military, the way that they've been attacked for actually being in Northern Ireland or in Afghanistan, for the actions that they've done, for the flags of your country not being allowed to be flown, and if you do, being regarded as a racist. If you are regarding yourself as English, you're a second class citizen in England. If you're Scottish or Welsh, then or Irish, we'll celebrate your National Saints Day with marches in London and pubs that you can go to and visit. But you won't do it on St. George's Day or any other of our major feasts. So if you have that culturally within your own country, and then secondly, you look around the elites, we have billionaires who've been running the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and controlling the agenda in this country and pushing down our wages with mass immigration. And if you look at nations like Russia or China, whose sole goal is to support their own citizens, just in the way that Donald Trump is now saying we support the citizens of the United States, but we're willing to give our political institutions power to the European Union. We're allowed others to come into this country and dilute our culture and our history. Again, you will look at those countries and go, well, if they invaded us, how would my life change? If you are a poorer plumber or electrician in this country, and you thought to yourself, I have Putin or the Chinese in charge, how much different would it be to my life? Well, actually, you might say, well, we probably won't have as much mass immigration into our country. We won't have the destruction of our Christian backgrounds if it was Russia. And actually, my life wouldn't change dramatically. But the ones who would are those who go to Oxford and Cambridge and Eton, who are running our countries. Maybe they wouldn't be in power, but I doubt it. And that's what they're doing. They've got twofold arguments. One is nothing would actually change if a different country come in. And if I did, what am I fighting for? Because the people I'm fighting for actually hate me. And that is why I think there is such a now destruction of the belief in this country and the support of it. And I think that's really what they want.
I think our enemies definitely do want that. All we have to look is, 150, 100 years ago, look at the Vichy government in France. They were French. They would call themselves patriots, French patriots running the country on behalf of Nazi Germany. And that's what some of our elites would do if we were invaded. But that's what the elites are doing now. They're doing it on behalf of the European Union, on the behalf of the WAF. They're already traitorous now, and they'll do anything for power. There's always been people in our societies who are quite willing to be traitors if it gets them a better quality of life and if it gives them power. We always have to be careful of traitors.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the reason we lost 1066 is because a cousin of Harold actually went over and supported William. So we've always got those people who are willing to stab their own citizens in their back just so that they can get a nicer house or a bigger estate or a membership of the House of Lords, or indeed they sit in some non-governmental organization or a company that they can give money to in terms of funding and receive some government grants back or reduction in taxes. All of those are happening. And I agree with you very much on this particular point, is that when you have a prime minister that has openly said on television that he prefers Davos to Parliament, that is exactly the pinnacle of the types of individual who are happier in the comfort of the individuals who are already in power at Davos or the World Economic Forum or those elitist groups, because that's where they feel that they want to be. And it doesn't matter that you're a Labour prime minister or a Conservative prime minister. I want a prime minister that actually wants to leave those institutions, looks down upon the people that go there, want to abolish any funding to companies involved and organized by it. I want them to remove themselves from that and say no more. That's the kind of prime minister who's willing to do all of that I would actually support. And I look across the very large ocean between ourselves and the United States, and I see them doing that. And that is something that I think is defense of your nation state and your people.
Completely agree. Before we go, let's leave our listeners with some good news. Tell me something positive. Tell me something that excites you. Tell me something that's making you happy about the state of the country and what's going on. What's the one good piece of news you can leave our viewers with?
Well, I would turn around and say it's spring, and just take a look at the window, get out into the countryside of our nation, go up to the Lake District, get down to Cornwall, go out to the Fens. The people of our country are still there. They're still in the pubs wanting to have a joke. There are those who still want to have a conversation with you in coffee shops or just whilst walking your dog. That is one of the most important things about us, the environment that we live in, and treasure it, just enjoy it. And that's what I do. And if you get the chance, just go and read our cultural history, visit a museum, go and see our history. I was at the Sir John Soanes Museum in Lincoln's Inn Field in London, and looking at somebody who came from a relatively poor background, although he married someone extraordinarily wealthy, and has collected items from all over the world in his house. We have a huge plethora still in this country of great histories, museums, castles. See it, enjoy it, and do one thing if you can. Pass it down to your children and your friends, as I do with my daughter.
No, absolutely. If we can embrace our culture and we can celebrate our culture and all the amazing things this island has done and all the science we invented and all the medicines we created, and we created the modern world and the Industrial Revolution, we need to remember these things, and we need to go to museums, read books, or just watch TV, documentaries, watch films, and celebrate what we've done, and then talk about it to people so it reminds them of what we've done. Until we increase our self-confidence as a nation, everything else is going to be a lot more difficult to fix. Stephen, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. We've had some IT issues along the way today, but we've resolved them. It's been an absolute pleasure. You're someone I've wanted to speak to now for many years, and I'm glad I finally sat down in front of you and we had a good conversation. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Nick, and thank you for reading your book. My England is something everybody should read. I think there's some brilliance in there. And who says that two old codgers can't sort out modern technology? Thanks very much, and I hope your listeners have a wonderful day too.
That's great. Cheers.
Take care.